Okay, good morning and welcome back. I hope everybody had a wonderful day yesterday and what a fantastic reception. We have another strong day of programs ahead. Here we go. We have the keynote followed by conquering regional air transportation with a reduced noise footprint, innovative strategies for qualifying and communicating aviation noise, climate change in aviation, measuring and modeling air quality missions, and then the noise policy review update. So strong program today. I wanted to again thank our sponsors, and I wanted to give everybody a tip that if you turn your tag around, you can be Justin Cook. It was funny, people had him backwards and everybody, it was a lot of Justin Cooks last night at the reception. So without further ado, I'll have Justin introduce the keynote.
Thank you, Darlene. Unfortunately, Peter had a last-minute thing that came up a couple days ago, and he's not able to make it in person, but he was nice enough to make a video recording for us this morning. He agreed to answer any questions you may have after the fact, so please submit your questions the typical way in Slido. If you would like to put your email address in there, that would be great because we could get back to you directly. We will have a mechanism to see who it is that is submitting the question and then get those to him. So he was nice enough to agree to do that. So before we play the video, I'll just give a little brief introduction. Mr. Peter Kirsch is a partner with Kaplan, Kirsch, and Rockwell. For more than 35 years, Peter has focused his practice on advising airport sponsors on financial matters, regulatory compliance, leasing, land use issues, environmental impacts, and community relations. For many of his infrastructure projects, Peter advises his clients on compliance with federal environmental laws, with a particular focus on NEPA and on the regulatory strings that come attached to federal funding of transportation infrastructure or use of federal lands. His contributions to the legal profession and his dedication to advancing the interests of his clients have cemented his status as a respected figure in our industry. And with that, we will hopefully be able to play his video. Let's see if we could do that.
Good morning. I'm very sorry that I can't be with you this morning in Palm Springs. A personal emergency kept me from being able to travel to Palm Springs. So I hope that this recording of my keynote presentation will be a satisfactory substitute. You heard a lot yesterday in great detail, technical information about community activities, airport efforts, and so on, having to do with addressing noise problems around airports. What I would like to do at this point is zoom out a little bit at the big picture, look at how we have been working together or not working together on land use compatibility over the course of the last generation. I want to talk first about how we got here today, a brief history of noise measurement and reporting, and talk about why I believe today we are at a bit of an inflection point in analyzing noise and addressing airport noise. And I will end with a modest proposal for addressing cooperation and communication between airports and their communities. I suppose as a lawyer, you probably expect me to put up slides something like this, and I will try not to do that. Neither will I do this necessarily, which I suspect a lot of you have heard plenty of, not here at this conference, but certainly back in your home airport. Instead, what I would like to do is go into the Wayback Machine and look at what has happened over the course of the last 50 years or so in airport noise mitigation and abatement and talk about where we are today. So let's go to the 1970s. 1970s were a time not just of great social upheaval, but it's important to recognize that the way in which we analyzed and examined and understood environmental impacts in the 1970s was really quite fundamentally different than today. 1970s was the era of most of the current federal environmental laws, most of the attention on the impacts that we were causing to our environment. 1970s were also a period of very different kind of aircraft than we have in the fleet today, primarily stage 1, some stage 2, and even an occasional stage 3 aircraft. And why is that important? The reason that's important is that these aircraft in the 1970s were fundamentally noisier than the aircraft that fly today. And when I say noisier, I mean simply based upon the decibel level generated by these aircraft, it was greatly in excess of what we see today. It's also important to recognize that in the 1970s, we looked a lot at the noise generated by aircraft on the average. How bad were community noise exposure on the average? And this chart illustrates the principle that I think informed a lot of the early decision making in the 1970s. That is that one very, very large event was treated similarly to 10 not quite so large events or 100 somewhat quieter events. And it's important to keep that in mind because it's a fundamental part of how we have learned to measure noise in the course of the last 50 years. So from this graphic, let me delve down a little bit into the 65 dB DNL. I would like to talk a little bit about DNL and how we got here and how DNL is being used. While a lot of the speakers yesterday talked in great detail about the technical elements of DNL and the 65 decibel threshold, I want to look at the policy issue. In particular, it's important to recognize how we came to use 65 and the DNL metric. The Noise Control Act of 1972 directed EPA to select a cumulative noise metric and to publish levels of noise requisite to protect public health and welfare with an adequate margin of safety. It's important to remember the language that's in the statute. It was directed to do a balancing between noise, public health, and safety. It was not supposed to be an absolute measure of noise, but a measure and a metric and a threshold that was designed to achieve those balances. The technical studies that resulted from the Noise Control Act of 1972 are now referred to as the 1974 EPA levels document. In 1976, the FAA issued its noise policy, the last finalized noise policy the FAA has issued. And again, that's sought to achieve a balance between desirable and technical and financially achievable measures to address noise. And the reason this is important is that we need to understand that balancing was done in the context of the 1970s. That is, what was desirable and technical and financially achievable in the 1970s, in fact, may be different today. To put not too fine a point on it, how you can reduce noise from a stage 1 aircraft and how you can mitigate noise from the so-called whisper jets is very different than it is today. And so we need to understand that the balancing that was being achieved at that point may in fact be different than the balancing we seek to achieve today. A little more history from the 1970s. Many of you, of course, are familiar with ASNA, the Aviation Safety and Noise Abatement Act of 1979. This was the statute that established the Part 150 program and directed the establishment of a single system of noise measurement. And a speaker yesterday emphasized this point, that ASNA did not direct the use of a single metric. It did not direct the use of a single threshold of land use compatibility. It merely wanted or directed the FAA to establish a system of noise measurement. And that system of noise measurement, of course, is the way in which noise has been measured for essentially all purposes by the FAA since 1979. FAA was also directed to identify land uses that are normally compatible with various noise exposures. Again, look at the language here. Identified land uses normally compatible. This was not intended to establish a federal standard or a federal requirement for noise compatibility with communities. So from ASNA in 1979 came Part 150 that we're all very familiar with, and then a number of years later, the Airport Noise and Capacity Act in 1990, and the FAA's proposed noise policy that was issued in 2000. As we move from this basic policy structure, it's important to keep in mind some language that I want to use here and that I think that we would be well advised to use with some precision. First of all, the regulation of noise at its source is set forth in Part 36 of the FAA regulations. This has to do with the noise generated by aircraft. Reporting of noise is regulated by ASNA and by Part 150. And I use the word regulate here somewhat loosely because, of course, ASNA and Part 150 are largely voluntary programs designed to report noise as opposed to regulate how much noise can occur. Planning for noise is set forth both in Part 150 and in the AIP and the PFC regulations, handbooks, and guidance. Mitigation of noise is addressed in Part 150 and also in AIP and PFC regulations. And finally, abatement of noise, which is something the FAA deals with very rarely, is addressed in a number of environmental statutes that really have very little to do with airports or with airport noise. Now, here is where things start to get really interesting. So in the previous slide, I talked about regulation, reporting, planning, mitigation, and abatement of noise. And what we have seen over the course of the last 50 years is that the requirements, the regulations, the reporting in each of these areas has begun to morph together. And there's really been a bootstrapping, I would say, of ASNA and Part 150 into areas totally unrelated to the reporting of noise for which those statute and regulations were created and the metric and the threshold were created. So, for example, the National Environmental Policy Act, under FAA Orders 1050 and 5050 and various directives and advisory circulars, the FAA has adopted the balancing that was mandated by ASNA and Part 150 into NEPA and used the same standards that are applicable to ASNA and 150 in NEPA as well. Similarly, the FAA and other federal agencies have done the same to Section 4F, a statute designed to protect parks and historic properties, and Section 106, the protection for National Historic Preservation properties. They've used the same basic standards that were established in ASNA and Part 150. Part 161 explicitly adopts some of the ASNA and Part 150 standards and thresholds and metrics in the evaluation of the potential applicability or the potential eligibility of noise access restrictions. Multiple court decisions, dozens of court decisions over the course of the last 50 years have in fact endorsed the FAA's decision to bootstrap ASNA and Part 150 throughout the airport noise realm and have given the FAA considerable discretion and deferred to the agency's expertise on these matters, in part because no agency, no other formal entity has offered a meaningful alternative to the 65 and the DNL that were established under ANSA and Part 150. Now, I don't say this with any particular criticism intended, merely as a historical fact that ASNA and Part 150 were established for one purpose, that is for the reporting of noise and the planning for noise compatibility, whereas the principles that were established there have over the course of the last 50 years been applied in contexts where they clearly were never intended in the original statute. So the evolution of the importance of the 65 decibel threshold and the DNL metric is enormous, and that evolution has taken place gradually over the course of the last 50 years, but has become pretty complete by the mid-2020s. While the 65 DNL threshold was developed for the narrow purpose in the 1970s and 80s of reporting noise and compliance with the ASNA requirement for a single system for measuring noise, its acceptance has evolved gradually, becoming more widespread in the reporting, planning, mitigation, abatement, funding. And the only thing it really hasn't been accepted in is the actual regulation of noise under Part 36. So the use of the 65 DNL threshold today is really enshrined not just in law, but in regulations, policy, guidance, and past practice, and legal precedents abound for the legitimacy of using this particular metric and this particular threshold. Deference to the FAA by the courts has certainly been a significant factor in this, and perhaps an issue that may change in the near future, and I'll talk about that in a moment. The reality, of course, as everyone at this conference knows, is that neither DNL nor 65 are the only available metric and the only available threshold for assessing, measuring, and regulating airport noise. It might have been the best in 1970s. I'm not here to judge whether or not there could have been other metrics at the time. It certainly was an appropriate one, and I think probably everyone would have agreed in the late 1970s that it was the best metric for reporting aircraft noise levels for the purpose of planning. It also may have been the best given the criteria or given the standard that Congress directed the FAA to have a single methodology for assessing noise levels. Again, highly appropriate, very useful, very robust, based upon dozens of studies that took place from the 1960s to the 1980s and even before until very recently. But let me go back to what I said a couple of moments ago. It's really important to understand how the choice of the metric came about. It was intended to strike a policy balance between practicality and widespread applicability. In other words, the principle was not to provide a pure scientific basis for measuring and recording aircraft noise, but rather to provide a metric that could be understood nationwide, a threshold that could be understood nationwide, and that balanced the fact that as a practical matter, certain noise levels could not be reasonably abated, could not be reasonably mitigated, simply because of the extensiveness of the noise impact. And what we've seen over the course of the last several years, certainly the last 20, 30 years, is a conflating of the metric and the threshold into sort of one stew. And it's really important to pull those apart. And we're beginning to see a little bit of that as people begin to discuss whether DNL remains the best metric, separate from the question of whether or not the threshold of 65 decibels is the right threshold for measuring land use compatibility. And as I said a moment ago, the only area in which 65 and DNL has not been bootstrapped throughout the airport noise realm is in the area of noise regulation, the Part 36 regulations, which in part are designed to mimic and are in response to ICAO and other national standards. It is useful to look at this chart from HMH from a number of years ago that illustrates the nature of the changing problem of airport noise. Look at, on the left, the population exposed to noise, and on the right, in purple, the number of enplanements. As Part 36 has become more and more successful at reducing the amount of noise generated by aircraft, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, the number of people exposed to noise has decreased at the same time that the number of enplanements, and to a lesser extent, the number of operations, has increased enormously since the 1970s. In other words, in the 1970s, addressing 7 million people who were exposed to what was considered to be an incompatible noise level was simply a much huger number than is present today at those same noise levels. And so when we talk about the practicality being a significant component of the selection of the 65 decibel threshold, it's important to recognize how many more people were exposed to noise at 65 decibels in the 1970s than are exposed to that same level today. With that history lesson, let me pause here for a moment to give a highly subjective, very personal report card on how I think all of these measures work together from the 1970s until about 2021. And there's a reason I'm selecting 2021 I'll come back to in a couple moments. So I think the DNL metric has proven to be really quite a good metric. It's a robust metric that has been very, very effective at measuring noise impacts in a number of different environments. Is it perfect? Of course not. Is it useful for every possible scenario? Of course not. But given the standards, given the legal requirements, given the fact that we wanted to establish a nationwide metric, DNL is pretty good. The 65 dB threshold, on the other hand, is not quite as good. It was probably an excellent threshold in the 1970s, given the directives of ASNA and given the need to balance the number of people exposed to noise versus the actual practicability of addressing those noise impacts. 65 dB threshold, probably in the late 1970s, I would have given it an A+. And now it's down to a B, and I would probably say it's going down gradually over time as it is becoming less and less useful as a threshold of noise compatibility. Local land use planning, which I'm going to get to in some detail in a moment, has been rather poor. You've heard discussions and rebuttals even in the sessions yesterday about the concept of you move near an airport, you should have known what was there. The fact is that local land use planning around airports has not been particularly aggressive at an awful lot of airports. And the reason today, 50 years on, that we still are encountering problems with residential property too close to an airport is that local governments have not taken up their share of the responsibility, particularly aggressively, to make sure that there is compatible land use around an airport. And there are a lot of asterisks to that comment, including the fact that noise has changed and the location of noise has changed. But I think the fact remains that land use planning has been moderate at best. The effectiveness of all of our tools at reducing conflict between airports and their neighbors has been moderate to okay. Not particularly good. I give it a B minus. Some communities, you heard a lot from Seattle, that has been very, very proactive and very aggressive at trying to reduce conflict, and in many respects quite successfully. There are other communities where very effective land use planning has been excellent at reducing conflict. I'm thinking Raleigh-Durham in particular. There are other places like Chicago where it's been less successful. So in general, reducing conflicts with the tools we have has been moderate. Aviation easements, another tool that has been ballied around as a vehicle for addressing noise, has really been quite unsuccessful. All that does is benefit the lawyers. It doesn't reduce impacts. It doesn't reduce animosity. It puts a little bit of money in the pockets of the people who first signed the easement and nothing going forward. It's not particularly useful. Lawyers love it, of course, because it reduces the potential for litigation if that's a significant factor. Part 150, if you look at what Part 150 is supposed to do and what it was designed to do, it's been quite successful. Part 150 is designed to be a planning tool for planning for the future of the airport and for land use around an airport to ensure compatibility. It's been quite effective at that. The problem, of course, is that many people have tried to stuff into the Part 150 box many things that don't belong in the Part 150 box, and we'll get into that in a little more detail. In general, I would say over the course of the last 50 years or so, community, airport, and FAA cooperation has been rather poor. There have been some stellar examples of really good cooperation where it has worked very, very well, individual airports or individual issues. But the breakdown amongst these four entities, these three entities, the community, the airport, and the FAA, often is such that one of the three of those is at loggerheads with the others and has been unsuccessful in an awful lot of communities at achieving the kind of peace or the kind of compatibility that we hope would be long term. In many respects, I think, fast forwarding to the 2020s, we are at another inflection point, similar in certain respects to what was taking place in the late 1970s and the increased emphasis on pollution, the increased emphasis on the impacts of noise on communities, and the increased attention to the importance of the federal government, the FAA, airports, and communities all working to address the problem of airport noise. So why are we at an inflection point today? There have been more studies of airport noise and its impacts, perhaps, than you can shake a stick at. And I've just listed here some of the key studies and points of decision-making over the course of the last 50 years, starting with FICON and FICON and FICAN. Is there anyone missing there? ASNA, ANCA. All of these were points at which either Congress or the scientific community or the FAA took stock and assessed how we were doing on noise impacts, how we were doing on mitigation of impacts. And there were really three, in my view, inflection points in looking at airport noise. The first was ASNA. I talked about a great deal in 1979, which was the first real national effort to address the impacts of airport noise on communities. The second was ANCA in 1990, which really changed the entire regulatory scheme for local airport sponsor efforts to address impacts of noise through operational restrictions and seized back to the federal government the control over airport operations much more so than had existed for the previous 50 years. And then the third inflection point is today. Now, why today in particular? And I think in certain respects that is the result of the release of the Neighborhood Environmental Survey in 2021 and how the communities, the FAA, the local affected communities, airports, industry, have been reacting to that survey. And that's the reason why I think to some extent we are at an inflection point today. Of course, most of this audience is already intimately familiar with the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, and in fact, probably more so than me in terms of the substance of what's in that document. You've already heard a lot from speakers, and you'll hear from more about the study that was conducted at the direction of Congress and was released in 2021. The FAA sought feedback on the study, got about 4,000 comments, and later, as a result of the survey, issued a notice that it was planning to review the agency's noise policy, which, as I noted earlier, hasn't been formally updated since 1976. This is not a formal revision to the noise policy, but it's a request for comment on how the agency should revise the noise policy. And if you can figure that out, let me know. But they've gotten about 4,800 comments on that as well. So what was the most important piece of the Neighborhood Environmental Survey? And here are two graphs. Everybody has seen these a number of times, having to do with the reaction of people, the level of annoyance people have to noise, and the fact that the Schultz curve, upon which much of the analysis leading to the 65 DNL threshold was based, turns out not to any longer be a particularly useful measure, not a particularly useful curve, not a particularly accurate curve, showing what people's reaction is to noise in 2022 and 2024. Now, the Neighborhood Environmental Survey could be the basis for any number of new discussions about the historic components of noise policy, whether that be the metric, the DNL, the threshold, 65 decibels, or the significance of impacts more generally. Should we be using decibels? Should we be using noise energy to measure impacts from aircraft noise? It certainly has led to the agency's decision to revise or review, or maybe to be more precise, to consider thinking about revising or think about reviewing the agency's noise policy. But it's also had a number of other effects as well. It has put pressure on regulators, as I say, the FAA, on legislators through Congress, on sponsors, that is airport sponsors, to adapt to the findings from this survey. As what should we do about it? This is new data. It seems to be relatively reliable data. It's scientifically defensible data. What do we do about it? And there has been language in FAA reauthorization and appropriation legislation since 2021 a number of times to address how FAA should respond to the Neighborhood Environmental Survey and what it should do and what it should not do. But the big question remaining is, will opponents of airport noise, that is those people, frankly, folks who really are populating much of this room today, will they try to use the study as a basis for attacking or challenging the legal underpinning of a whole series of noise policies that I talked about earlier? We don't know whether that in fact will occur, but there certainly has been a lot of gossip among the community groups about the possibility of using this survey, this data, as a basis for challenging what has really been enshrined in law for 50 years. And that leads me to a number of legal considerations that I think are very important to consider today, not just in light of the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, but in light of new data and new technology and new understanding of the impacts of airport noise. First of all, it's really important to distinguish the metric and the threshold. The metric, one can argue, was established by Congress in ASNA when they directed the FAA to establish a single system. The threshold, the 65 decibel threshold, was established as a regulatory matter by the FAA. And those two distinctions are important because the manner in which those get changed is different. Obviously, Congress has to adopt a law if the metric is to change for all purposes, but FAA as a regulatory matter can change what the threshold is. It's also really important here to distinguish law and policy. There is remarkably little law on the subject of airport noise. There are a number of court decisions, some of which are very, very important, but most of the court decisions come down to an issue of deference, whether the courts are going to defer to the FAA's judgment on how to measure, report, address, mitigate, abate noise, as opposed to whether or not, in fact, the threshold and the metric are appropriate. So there's a real question here as to whether legislative change is necessary or even desirable. That is, within the context of the very limited scope of what legislation does exist out there, does the FAA have the discretion, does the FAA have the authority to make changes in the way in which noise is reported, the way in which we address noise, the way in which noise is mitigated, without any legislative changes? It's really important to understand, however, that any change, whether the change be in the metric or in the threshold, it must be transparent, thoughtful, collaborative, and must consider the different uses of such data. And this last point is very important. We've learned in the last 50 years that none of the various statutes, none of the various requirements stand in isolation. So if you were to change the metric, change the threshold for Part 150 purposes, would that also necessarily mean a change in other ways in which this metric and this threshold are used, for example, in environmental reviews under NEPA, 4F, and so on? The transparency and the collaborative component are equally important here, because the FAA had the advantage, if you want to call it that, in the 1970s, that noise was viewed as an overwhelming problem, and FAA was simply trying to reduce the problem as much as they practically could. Today, the problem is very, very different. It's a matter of balancing a different set of criteria, a different set of considerations than existed in 1979. And so making sure that any sort of discussion of a change in the metric or change in the threshold has to be collaborative among all of the interests today, which in fact are somewhat different than they were in 1979. Then there's the question of state law and policy on noise reporting and impacts. Many states have deferred to the FAA, used the FAA's science, used the FAA's analysis and guidance for their own state environmental law purposes. And so if the threshold or if the metric were to be changed, what's going to happen to state law? And the final point, which is very timely, unfortunately, today, is that there's an issue of Chevron deference. And I won't go into that in great detail, otherwise I'll have to put up that first slide about lawyers being boring. But Chevron is a principle that says that the courts will defer to agencies in their interpretation of statutes when those interpretations are reasonable and when Congress has delegated to that agency the responsibility for implementing the statute. It's a pretty broad-based principle that essentially is the basis upon which the courts defer to agencies and agency decision-making. The Supreme Court is considering reversing, abolishing, modifying Chevron in a case before the court right now that's expected, the court's expected to decide before this coming June. What does that all mean here? Well, a great deal of the success of FAA in litigation over noise has come from the fact that the courts have deferred to the agency's expertise on matters of noise and deferred to the agency's aeronautical expertise in assessing whether or not the way in which the agency reports noise is reasonable. Phrased another way, the courts have, in essence, thrown up their hands and said what the FAA has done is reasonable. It may or may not be the only way to measure noise, report noise, but it's reasonable, and we will defer to that. If the Chevron principle is abolished, and if the courts no longer are directed to defer to agency expertise or defer to agencies when the Congress has given that agency direction, that may suggest a pretty wide-range litigation coming forward over by litigants who are going to challenge the propriety of the agency's decisions without the benefit of the deference that the courts have afforded over the course of the last many decades. Now, by no means does the Neighborhood Environmental Survey suggest, imply, or even ask for sort of a wholesale abolition of either the metric or the threshold, sort of throwing the baby out with the bathwater. But there may be options available to the FAA in light of that survey to look at tweaks, to look at changes in the way in which it reports noise and the way in which it funds noise mitigation. So there could be, at the one extreme, agency-wide revisions of the metric or the threshold. I think those are not particularly likely, at least anytime soon. But there may instead be selected revisions, and we're seeing some of these around the edges, whether it be in NEPA, Section 4F, or Section 106, Part 150, 161, a number of areas in which the FAA could allow for increased flexibility in use of additional metrics or supplemental metrics, as they already allow, or substitute metrics in some instances where a community can show that it is appropriate that the DNL or the 65 is not the best metric to use in light of the Neighborhood Environmental Survey. The FAA may also decide to make selected revisions with regard to particular regulatory programs, like Part 161, or the use of airport revenue for noise mitigation, or AIP or PFC funding. The fact is, the agency has already begun to show some flexibility in some instances without abandoning the threshold entirely, and without saying that 65 or DNL is dead. They've allowed additional flexibility for airport sponsors in certain instances to use supplemental metrics or to go outside the contours that are established by 65 DNL. The other related question, of course, is what about other government agencies? We're talking, of course, here primarily about the FAA and how the FAA deals with this metric and this threshold. But we know that other agencies, whether it be EPA or HUD or the Veterans Administration or other DOT modal agencies, have to address this question as well. And they don't have the benefit of the 50 years of studies and the 50 years of experience the FAA does in use of the 65 and the DNL. So we may, in fact, see greater flexibility from those agencies going. I think it's fair to say that there really is no consensus in the industry, even say around this room, as to what to do about the Neighborhood Environmental Survey and what its consequences are. It's interesting, the ACINA, for example, in its comments on that survey said it is critical for the FAA to take into account and to reflect the different experiences in different communities. Many years ago, this would have been an absolute radical thought, because the FAA very much wanted to stick to a national, uniform way of reporting, measuring, and mitigating noise. And here's ACI, the industry organization, saying that we need to consider different needs of different communities. Congress is certainly doing this as well. Congress is saying, well, my community, my district is special and deserves special treatment. And while a lot of this legislation doesn't ultimately make it out of Capitol Hill, we are seeing more and more interest by particular members of Congress to say that the Neighborhood Environmental Survey is suggesting a need to reassess the nationwide uniformity in how noise is measured and how noise is reported. So I think what we can say is that there's been a gradual acceptance of alternative and supplemental metrics for the purpose of at least reporting noise impacts, if not mitigating them. And local determinations on land use compatibility are becoming more and more accepted. Legally, they've always been permissible, but with a couple of very small exceptions, most communities have not, in fact, taken advantage of the language that the FAA put in its Part 150 regulations that invite communities to establish their own local thresholds for land use compatibility. I mean, to some extent, what we're facing here today in this lack of consensus is a bit of a deja vu to the 1970s and 80s, and a little bit of what led to ASNA in the first place. A lack of consensus, splintered approaches to how we are measuring noise and how we should deal with noise, and what's an appropriate action to take in response to noise, and litigation as a result over all these issues. And so much of what we were trying to address and solve with ASNA and the 1970s policy statements and studies, we're seeing again in the 2020s. So the question then, I suppose, becomes what's next? I mean, what are the triggers and what are the policy considerations for deciding how do we move forward from what I've called an inflection point for determining what are we going to do, how are we going to report, what are we going to establish as acceptable noise impacts in the late 2020s and 2030s. The current administration's focus on climate change and environmental justice certainly has an impact on this, as the nation is coming to realize that the impacts of airport noise disproportionately affect communities of color and lower income communities, and the environmental justice implications, which are very important as a policy matter, are becoming more important in the addressing of airport noise. Another sort of interesting trigger or policy consideration is will the public and Congress accept more studies, or are we studied out? And a usual Congress solution when there's a huge problem that's controversial is they direct GAO to do a study, or they direct FAA to do a study. Is that going to be acceptable? We certainly have had many, many studies, some of which have been very good, some less so, on how to address noise, how to report noise, and so on. Is that going to be sufficient? Or is there going to be pressure from communities for Congress, for the FAA, for airports to actually act on new thresholds and new measures of compatibility? And what's the transition going to look like? I mean, FAA can't tomorrow say, we changed our mind, we're not going to use DNL, or we're not going to use 65, because of the mammoth implications that would have throughout the country for communities that have already mitigated and feel they've done a very good job of mitigating noise, and discover that the way in which they mitigated is no longer considered to be state of the art in 2020. So what transition is appropriate there? And the FAA is dealing with this in other contexts, having to do mostly with noise insulation, but transition for programs that have been in place for 50 years is a complex issue. And will there be new legal challenges? Are we going to see, for example, in light of what the Supreme Court is likely to do about Chevron deference, are we going to see new challenges to the DNL metric or to the 65 threshold? As I said, those have been almost uniformly unsuccessful over the course of the last 50 years, in large part because of Chevron deference. If the Supreme Court abolishes or modifies Chevron deference, will that make a difference? And there's no telling. But I think it's likely there will be some litigation. And then I suppose there's the question of, do we want or do we even trust Congress to find or dictate the right answer to all of these policy considerations, and find the right answer in how we should move forward? As a very practical matter, I think we need to think about what happens if the FAA or Congress does change the threshold or the metric at some point in the future. It's not going to be, as I suggested, likely to be a wholesale change in which all the previous law is thrown out. But what is it going to mean for NEPA and documentation and the scope of NEPA reviews, state environmental reviews? I mean, there's a whole catalog of measures that are going to have to be considered if Congress or the FAA were to consider changing the threshold or the metric, or even allowing more flexibility for F determinations in terms of impacts on parks and historic properties. Part 150 mitigation funding, a very big deal issue. Airspace redesign, federal funding, AIP and PFC eligibility, the permissible use of airport revenue for mitigation outside the 65 dB contour, noise reporting generally, and legal precedents. I mean, all these are problems, serious issues that have to be considered if, as I think many people are urging, the time has come for us to examine alternatives to supplements to the 65 threshold and the DNL metric. So I guess the question is, where do we go from here? I mean, I suppose we could sprint forward and not look back, or we can put our heads in the sands. But I would like instead to offer a bit of a modest proposal, sort of a performance plan for how to address the changes wrought not just by the data from the Neighborhood Environmental Survey, but from changes in how we examine noise generally, how we perceive environmental impacts such as noise more broadly, how the FAA can and cannot mitigate and abate noise. And I'm going to list 3 categories, and I'm going to go through them all in a little bit of detail here. One is adapt to community differences. Number 2, take responsibility for land use planning. Number 3, accept other ways of reporting noise. Number 4, accept limited airspace inefficiencies. 5, share responsibilities. And 6, only as a last resort, go to Congress. So I'd like to spend a little time walking through each of these 6 points. The first one may be self-evident, which is we need to accept that not all communities are alike. To suggest that the noise impacts in downtown Manhattan and in rural Colorado are the same is just silly, in my view. We need to accept, the FAA needs to accept, and airports need to accept that there has to be some adaptation to the needs of the community, and recognize that a 65 DNL as a threshold for impacts in Queens may be ridiculously low, and the same threshold may be ridiculously high in a different neighborhood. Once we accept that, our ability to address noise impacts in a meaningful way increases enormously. does not require a change in law. It doesn't require a change in regulations. It may require flexibility in FAA policymaking that says that mitigation is possible outside the 65 DNL context if an airport sponsor meets certain criteria, and we'll talk about those in the next slide. The second piece, which I feel very strongly about, is that local communities need to take responsibility for real land use planning. And what that means, it goes back and point to some of the comments that folks made during presentations yesterday, is that whether it is communities coming to the noise or whether it is localities unwilling to accept the fact that they cannot have residential near an airport, the local community needs to take responsibility for making sure that they adopt the local land use regulations that are in accord with the threshold they want the FAA to establish. And this is very important. If a community wants the FAA and the airport sponsor to address noise, for example, at a 60 DNL threshold, then they need to take the responsibility for land use planning to the 60 DNL threshold so that they do their part. Very few communities are willing to do this. Very few communities are willing to accept that a metric that's good for the FAA is also a metric that's good for them. And until they do that, you will almost inherently have a conflict. Good example of that is, two good examples are Naples and Raleigh-Durham. In Naples, the local community adopted a 60 DNL threshold for new land use, for new residential use around the airport. And that has been relatively successful in making sure there aren't any new developments near that airport while the airport works to mitigate impacts at the 60 instead of the 65 level. Similarly, at Raleigh-Durham, if you take a look on Google Earth at the area around Raleigh-Durham Airport, there's almost no residential within the 60 DNL. And the reason being that in the 1980s and late 80s, early 90s, Raleigh-Durham Airport worked with the communities to say that the airport would mitigate noise, but the communities had to establish very rigid, very aggressive measures to protect against encroachment of the airport. So it is a two-way street. Unless the community is willing to adopt the kind of land use that meaningfully restricts new development, the airport should not be responsible for mitigating the impacts at a different level than the community is willing to adopt as its own local regulations. Point 3. Increasingly, it's becoming apparent to me that noise energy measured in decibels is not the only way to report noise impacts. And we heard a lot about this in sessions yesterday as well, is that we need to understand what we are measuring. At a time when the noise levels of aircraft, the whisper jet, the stage 1, the stage 2 jet aircraft were so great, decibels was a terrific measure. But there are many instances in which it's the number of occurrences rather than the decibel level, or it's the delta between the ambient and the impact and the event level that's so important. We frequently hear, particularly in the context of next gen and flight tracks, that communities will accept 5 overflights a day at X level or 10 overflights a day at X level, but 200 is unacceptable. Well, because of the way the DNL is measured, the 200 and the 10 may not show very significant DNL differences, but they're very significant in terms of the impact to the community. And so we must understand that there's a need to develop a metric that's meaningful with respect to number of occurrences and whether there are number of occurrences that are acceptable in a community where the level is above an ambient and what to do about the number of occurrences. This will become more apparent as the eVTOL and UAS aircraft become more common. These are relatively quiet aircraft, but anybody who has heard a drone overhead knows that they are monstrously irritating because of the timbre, because of the nature of the noise, and because it interrupts daily speech, not because the noise level in decibels is so extraordinary. Number 4. And this may be the single most controversial recommendation, and that is that the FAA needs to expect that in certain instances, inefficiencies are acceptable in the balancing. The FAA talks a lot about balancing. Balancing has been the key word of addressing noise impacts back to the 1970s. The problem is there's been a weight on that balance. That weight has favored the national aviation system. And so long as the FAA establishes that we can accept no inefficiencies, or to be a little bit more generous, we have very little tolerance for inefficiencies, then the solutions that are available become much more limited. And the FAA and airports have to accept that some inefficiencies, I'm not putting a number on that, but some inefficiencies may be necessary to achieve the right balance. And that is particularly true where there may be modifications to flight tracks that can have significant noise benefits, but a very small inefficiency in terms of operations. And that's going to require a philosophical change of some importance to the agency. Number 5, a lot of the regulations and the statutes are not drafted to assume real shared responsibility. Most of them are drafted so that airports must adapt to their communities, or communities must adapt to their airports, or the FAA should direct traffic based upon efficiency and safety. And each of those statements, in a sense, is destructive. Accepting true shared responsibility means that each of the players in the system, FAA, local governments, communities, airports, have to take responsibility for their portion of the impact and recognize that the others are going to do so as well. And that this is not simply a problem for the FAA to solve. This is not simply a problem for airports to solve, and so on. That each of the participants has to step up. And again, this is a sort of balancing of the nature that was originally done in 1979 that says that we will all share the responsibility. And a couple of my previous points, I think, stress this, particularly with regard to real land use planning and an acceptance of some level of inefficiencies in the national aviation system. The last point, and this is a very last point, is going to Congress is really the last resort. Congress is, I don't have to tell you, is inefficient and not particularly able to make difficult policy choices. And by asking Congress to jump into what is essentially an intensely local problem, it's a national problem, but it's a local problem in its manifestation, is very, very difficult, and is only going to be the source of frustration. And I fear, because of the imbalance in lobbying in Congress, once Congress takes a hold of it, could indeed do something worse rather than better than what we've got today. So with that, I'm going to leave you a slide with some selected sources. These are going to be available for folks afterwards, just the sources that I relied upon in preparing this presentation. There are, needless to say, hundreds more, but I think particularly for folks who are relatively new to this field may provide some useful background reading. Some are more intellectual than others, and a lot of FAA regulations are here as well. Regrettably, since I'm not there in person, I'm not going to be able to take your questions this morning, but I believe the conference organizers are figuring out how to assemble your questions so I can respond later in writing, or perhaps we'll have an opportunity later in the day for a Q&A session separate from this. So again, my apologies for not being able to be with you this morning, and congratulations on a great conference. I look forward to seeing all of you at another conference soon enough. Thank you very much.